By the 1890s, people realized there was a great many social and political problems in the United States due to industrialization. The Progressive Era, roughly 1890 1929, was a period where reformers believed they could change society through the application of science, education, regulation, incentives, and prison reforms. Rehabilitation into society, not punitive punishment for deterrence. All right, now the first Progressive Era movement I'll discuss is the social gospel movement. What is the social gospel movement and what were its goals? Well, a guy by the name of Washington Gladden, an American clergyman, believed Christian law covers every relation of life, including relationships between employers and their employees. It was the first national call for such a universal application of Christian values in everyday life. Historians considered Gladden to be one of the social gospel movement's founding fathers. Now, the social gospel strived to relieve the social and economic problems of American society by living out the ethical and moral systems presented by Jesus in the New Testament. So in other words, what would Jesus do? Okay, the support of the social gospel and the progressive movement, for that part, were predominantly from the middle class. Now, the progressive movement was also about stopping the widespread political corruption of the political machines, breaking up the monopolies of the business trusts, busting those trusts through the Sherman antitrust law. Suffragette movement was there, prohibition. Another important aspect of the progressive movement was the use of scientific method to bring about changes in medicine, engineering, government reform, and also bring reform in public education, finance, insurance, industry, railroads, churches. The field of scientific management was used to increase efficiency and profit. The efficiency expert was born at this time. Now, did this just start spontaneously? Heck no. Enter the mass media and journalism. Nothing sells like sensation, whether it's real or made up. In this case, it was real. Now, with the ability to implement nationwide advertising, the mass media magazines were able to lower the cost of their publication, which in turn increased their readership. The exposés of corruption, whether in business or in politics, created a hungry audience in the middle class consumer. Okay, now the muckrakers. They were the ones that exposed the seedy side of society. Journalists such as Lincoln Steffens, who exposed public corruption in New Jersey and New York. Jacob Riis, the photographer journalist, he exposed the plight of the urban poor and the horrific conditions of tenement slums. Ida Tarbell, a famous female journalist of the period, she exposed the corruption of John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Then there was Upton Sinclair. He was an author who investigated the Chicago meatpacking industry. The result was his book, The Jungle. Now, this is just one excerpt from his book, The Jungle. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from the leaky roof would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poison bread out for them. They would die. Then the rat bread and meat would go into the hopper. Those are containers. This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat would be shoveled into the carts, and the men who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat, even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. There was no place for the men to wash their hands before they ate their dinner, and so they made a practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. Some of it would then make its way into a smoked sausage, but as smoking took time and was therefore expensive, they would call upon their chemistry department and preserve it with borax and color it with gelatin to make it brown. Now, the public was so outraged at the unsanitary and disgusting conditions in the meatpacking industry that laws were soon passed to safeguard the consumer and the nation's meat supply. Today it is called the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. It was through the efforts of these journalists that reform movements took hold. We have a thing called the Settlement House movement. Now, this was also an important part of the progressive movement. American settlements were in neighborhoods populated by recent European immigrants. Now, a few of them who could even speak English. Thus, the first outreach was to children and mothers through daycare, nurseries, kindergarten, and small play lots. Mothers, clubs for English class, and groups interested in arts and craft and music and drama. The most famous settlement house was the Hull House in Chicago, established by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. Now, in politics, we have direct elections of senators and the primary system. Now, they were put into place in the hopes that the direct elections and the primaries would break that stranglehold the corrupt political bosses and party machines had over the election process. And it did work, but in recent times, the primary system has resulted in a number of hack candidates being elected to office who, in my opinion, wouldn't know how to pour water out of a boot even if the directions were on the bottom of the heel with large red arrows saying, "Look here." Okay, so why are we having this problem? Well, it's very simple. Politicians play to their base voting bloc. These are people who will get out and vote in every election right down to dog catcher. Voter turnout is very low during the primaries. So, at the general election, in some cases, we have mediocre political hacks running on both tickets. Now, until the American public understands the importance of the primary system, we will continue to limit our choices for effective leadership. Okay, now one example of the primary system working, though, for the people was the 2022 primary season. Three-term Congresswoman Liz Cheney was not paying attention to the people in her district. She did not listen to what they wanted and what they needed. She believed her renomination as Republican candidate for Wyoming's only congressional seat was a given. Well, the people of Wyoming primaried Ms. Cheney, meaning she didn't even get the nomination from her party for the general election. Okay, anyways, back to the reform movement. Now, the suffragette movement. This was a drive for women's rights to vote. It might surprise you that even by the early 20th century, many men were against women having the vote. Okay, hang on. I know I'm getting virtual daggers thrown at me for that statement. I do not believe it, but that is what the majority of the male population believed. Now, in the origins of the women's movement and women's rights was the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton convened a two-day conference in Seneca Falls, New York. The turnout was not great, about 300 men and women. However, it was during this convention that Stanton wrote the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. This document was the opening salvo, that's a shot, of the women's movement to attain civil, social, and political and religious rights of women. Now, Susan B. Anthony was also involved with her in this early movement. Now, Stanton and Anthony started the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1851. 70 years later, another woman by the name of Alice Paul came onto the scene. Now, her accomplishments in the women's suffrage movement are legendary. She used the tactics of civil disobedience to push a cause. She also paid the price for her civil disobedience. While she was in Britain, she was sentenced to 30 days in jail, and while in jail, she went on a hunger strike. Now, the authorities had to force feed her just to keep her alive to finish her 30-day sentence. It was considered bad form to have a suffragette die in custody, obviously. And then in 1913, Paul organized the Women's Suffrage Procession in Washington, D.C. The day before President Wilson's inauguration, Paul and her 8,000 supporters were going to stick it to President-elect Wilson. You see, besides being a racist bigot, Wilson, the great progressive, did not believe women should have the right to vote. Now this brings me to Margaret Sanger. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood and the controversial use of birth control. Now, she is not as pure as some people think, but I don't think she's as I don't think she's a genocidal maniac as others believe. So, what is my point? Well, in the early part of the 20th century, neonatal care was basically in the dark age, so to speak. Sanger was an advocate for birth control, and in 1900, for every 100,000 births, 850 mothers died from problems related to pregnancy and childbirth. But it was considered inevitable and had to be accepted. Well, Margaret Sanger thought otherwise. Now, she would run afoul of the Federal Parent Act, Section 211, which was passed on March 3, 1873, as the Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use. Birth control was considered an article of immoral use at that time. Now, Sanger's crusade for birth control and the development of Planned Parenthood clinics to give women a choice on contraception was viewed at that time as radical. Now, she would be sentenced to 30 days in the workhouse for breaking the law when she opened a family planning and birth control clinic in New York City in 1916. Okay, now here's the dark side to Margaret Sanger. She was an advocate for eugenics. Now, eugenics movement became very popular throughout the world during the first half of the 20th century. The advocates of eugenics movement, and there were many, believed in selective breeding to remove defects from the human race. You could say this was the result of the progressive movement's use of scientific methods to improve society at all levels. Now, we as a society could breed out all the negative aspects of society, such as feeble-mindedness, genetic disorders, criminal and antisocial behavior, and racial improvement. Now, at the time, world-renowned experts believed this scientifically erroneous and immoral theory of racial improvement was valid. Yep, the science was settled. This was the wave of the future. How many times have I heard that in the past few years? Okay, now the Supreme Court actually made it law by affirming a Virginia statute that made enforced sterilization legal. It was called Buck v. Bell, May 2nd, 27. Carrie Buck was a feeble-minded woman who was committed to a state mental institution. Her condition had been present in her family for the last 3 generations. A Virginia law allowed for the sexual sterilization of inmates of state institutions to promote the health of the patient and the welfare of society. But before that procedure could be performed, however, a hearing was required to determine whether or not the procedure was a wise thing to do. A hearing was held. The state of Virginia believed that approving that procedure was a wise thing to do. Now, the decision was appealed. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Citing the best interest of the state, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, considered one of the wisest jurists ever to serve on the Supreme Court after John Marshall, affirmed the value of the Virginia statute. In order to prevent, this is what he said, in order to prevent the nation from being swamped with incompetence and 3 generations of imbeciles, it's enough. So, the Supreme Court decision, Carrie Bell was sterilized. Holmes was cited by lawyers for a Nazi defendant in the sterilization trials after World War II. Yeah? So, Margaret Sanger, a racist? I'm not sure. To answer that question, you would need to go through all the primary source evidence. The answer cannot be derived from what we would call today a few sound bites. Okay, I'm heading over 10-minute mark right now. Now, in the next video, I'll discuss the politicians of the reform movement. I hope you found this video helpful. Now, if you did, please hit the like button, ring the notification bell, and subscribe to my channel. But most importantly, leave a comment below. Now, as always, review your notes for about 10 minutes every night. It does help. And try to pay attention in class. I know, stuff happens, but just try. Alright, anyways, thank you for watching.